Ever feel like, what's the word? Like society's been feeding us, a fairy tale about love and relationships.
Yeah.
Like maybe those happily ever afters are more complicated than they seem.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're about to find out. Today we're doing a deep dive into Christopher Ryan's Sex at Dawn
Okay.
to unpack some seriously thought-provoking ideas about human sexuality, monogamy, and what's really natural for our species.
Right.
Get ready to challenge some deeply ingrained assumptions.
Yeah, we're going way beyond those like oversimplified narratives about, cavemen and nuclear families and all that.
Yeah, exactly. Ryan, he starts with this great anecdote, right, about encountering some monkeys in Indonesia.
Uh-huh.
And his wife offered them these nuts, and one monkey just snatched the treats, scratched her hand, and vanished into the jungle. It was crazy. You might be surprised to hear that this seemingly insignificant event, right,
Yeah.
sparked this whole philosophical crisis for Ryan.
Really?
Yeah. It made him question this whole idea of nature being inherently innocent and humans being morally superior.
I see.
He realized, hey, we're apes too.
Yeah.
We've got this long evolutionary history shaped by social structures that might surprise you.
Yeah, and to understand those structures, right, we have to confront how often we Flintstonize prehistory.
Flintstonize, yeah.
We impose our modern ideas about family and our relationships onto the past, creating this inaccurate and frankly self-serving image of how things used to be.
Yeah, like that classic image of a nuclear family hanging out in a cave, complete with animal skin outfits and perfectly behaved children.
Exactly. And those images are often more about our modern hang-ups than actual evidence. Like thinkers like Hobbes with his nasty, brutish, and short view of prehistory, or Rousseau and his idealized noble savage. They've all colored how we view the past.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to understand our ancestors through a distorted lens.
Right.
And that makes it even harder to grasp the full picture of human sexuality, really.
It does.
But there are other ways to approach this, right? One is by looking at our closest primate relatives, the bonobos.
Oh, the bonobos, right?
They're about as far from Hobbesian as you can get.
Totally.
So different.
Bonobos are fascinating because they use sex for everything. To resolve conflict, strengthen social bonds, you name it.
Wow.
It's a stark contrast to chimpanzees, who are all about dominance, hierarchy, and aggression.
So it's like they embody the make love, not war philosophy.
They really do. And you know what else is intriguing?
What's that?
Bonobo females form these powerful alliances, challenging that deeply ingrained assumption about universal male dominance.
Interesting.
It really makes you question what's truly natural when it comes to gender roles and power dynamics, even in humans.
Yeah, it's like Ryan is saying, hey, before we assume our ways are the only ways, let's look at how other primates organize themselves. And speaking of challenging norms, he brings up the Mosuo people of China. Have you ever felt pressured to conform to societal expectations about relationships?
Oh, absolutely.
The Mosuo experience really, really challenges us to examine those assumptions.
Yeah, in Mosuo culture, you see women's sexual freedom is the norm, and paternity isn't the central concern like it is in many other cultures.
Interesting.
They have this system of walking marriages where women essentially choose their partners and move freely between them.
Wow, it's like flipping the script on jealousy and possessiveness, which we're often told are these inevitable parts of love and relationships.
Exactly. The Mosuo example really throws a wrench into the traditional evolutionary psychology narrative that claims certain mating preferences are universal. It highlights how much culture shapes our experiences and expectations.
It does. So we're already starting to see cracks in that monogamy is natural argument. And then Ryan throws another curveball, the theory of sperm competition. It suggests that men's biological drive for multiple partners might have evolutionary roots because it increases the chances of passing on their genes.
Right, you can see this play out in the animal kingdom, too.
Hmm.
Different species have developed various strategies to maximize their reproductive success.
It's true. And Ryan connects this back to humans by pointing to things like variations in testicle size across populations and the prevalence of cuck-wait-and-boy fantasies, where men fantasize about their partners being with other men.
Yeah, okay. Of course, we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions based on anatomy or fantasies alone.
Right.
Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Absolutely. And to Ryan's credit, he acknowledges that.
Okay.
He pushes back against this overly simplistic idea that penis size or testicle volume are the be-all and end-all when it comes to understanding human mating behavior.
He emphasizes that we can't ignore the profound influence of culture and environment.
Right.
Just because something is biological doesn't mean it's predetermined. We have the capacity for choice, for shaping our desires and behaviors.
Totally. So it's getting complicated, but in a good way, right?
It is.
It's like peeling back the layers of a fascinating mystery.
Exactly. And like any good mystery, there are twists and turns. Which brings us to one of the more, shall we say, colorful parts of the book, the Coolidge effect.
You're right.
Yeah.
That one definitely got my attention, and it's exactly what you think it is. This phenomenon observed in many species, including humans, where males experience renewed sexual vigor when they have a new partner.
You know that old joke about President Coolidge and the rooster?
I think so, yeah.
Well, that's where the name comes from, yeah. It's a funny story.
Right.
But, Ryan uses it to explore some very real relationship challenges that a lot of people experience. Think about those classic tropes. It's in the 7-year itch or the infamous midlife crisis.
Right.
These could be examples of that biological drive for novelty kicking in.
Interesting. So instead of just labeling those behaviors as selfish or immature, maybe there's a deeper biological component at play.
Exactly. Ryan even connects this to testosterone levels,
Okay.
suggesting that long-term monogamy might actually suppress testosterone in men over time. It really challenges us to rethink what we consider a successful relationship
Right.
and whether monogamy, as it's traditionally practiced, truly aligns with our evolved nature.
It's interesting because Ryan, he doesn't shy away from talking about infidelity, which is often considered this taboo topic.
Right.
He doesn't just condemn it outright, though.
Right.
Instead, he uses it as a lens to examine that tension between our evolved tendencies and our cultural norms.
And that's where things get really interesting. He points out that infidelity is rampant across cultures,
Wow.
despite the moral stigma and potential consequences.
Which suggests it might be more than just a matter of individual choice or moral failing.
Hmm.
If monogamy was as natural and effortless as we're often led to believe, wouldn't infidelity be less prevalent?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of Ryan's argument. He argues that we've been trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, creating these rigid social structures that might not necessarily align with our evolved desires and predispositions.
It's like this constant push and pull between nature and culture.
Exactly.
To illustrate this point, Ryan shares the story of Phil,
Okay.
this middle-aged guy who has an affair and ends up getting kicked out of his house.
Right.
Story many of us have heard before. But Ryan presents it in a way that makes you think.
It's that classic tale of the midlife crisis, that feeling of being stuck in a rut and searching for something more.
Right.
It's easy to judge Phil for his choices,
Yeah.
but Ryan encourages us to look deeper.
Phil talks about feeling trapped, like he was in a life or death situation and just needed to feel alive again. It's heartbreaking, even if you don't condone his actions.
Absolutely. And it highlights the complexity of human emotions.
Yeah.
Phil wasn't a bad guy. He loved his wife, he loved his family, but something was missing.
Yeah.
And that something might have been, as strange as it sounds, driven by biology.
Because as Ryan points out, there's research showing that long-term monogamy can actually lower testosterone levels in men.
So, Phil's affair, though obviously hurtful and misguided, could be interpreted as a subconscious attempt to reclaim that lost vitality, to reignite that primal spark.
That is a fascinating and unsettling thought.
It is.
It's definitely making me rethink some things.
Yeah.
But it feels important to have these conversations, even if they're uncomfortable.
Right.
If we're going to understand human sexuality, we can't just ignore these realities.
I agree. We can't just sweep these inconvenient truths under the rug.
So where does that leave us? Are we doomed to a life of cheating and heartbreak? Is monogamy destined to fail?
I wouldn't say doomed. Ryan's not saying that monogamy can't work or that it's inherently bad, but his book does challenge us to be more realistic about those traditional notions of love, sex, and relationships.
He's not claiming to have all the answers, but he does suggest that maybe, just maybe, we need to be more open to alternative relationship models.
He mentions polyamorous relationships, for example.
Right.
And while that's not for everyone, it does demonstrate that there are other ways to structure relationships.
Right.
Ways that might better align with our evolved nature.
Right.
At least for some people.
He even talks about those key parties that were apparently popular back in the WWII pilot days,
Right.
where couples would swap partners.
It's a good reminder that our social norms and expectations are not set in stone. What might seem radical or even shocking today might have been commonplace in the past, or could become commonplace in the future.
It's all about questioning those rigid assumptions about what relationships should look like, being willing to explore new possibilities, and having honest conversations about what we want and need from our relationships. It's a pretty powerful message, wouldn't you say?
It is, and one that's especially relevant today. We're constantly bombarded with these conflicting messages about love, sex, and relationships. We're told to find the one, to settle down, to be monogamous, and live happily ever after. But as Ryan so brilliantly illustrates, the reality is far messier and more nuanced than that.
So embracing that complexity, being open to new ideas and perspectives, might be the key to finding a fulfilling and sustainable approach to love and relationships.
I think you're right.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. From those sneaky monkeys to the complexities of infidelity and alternative relationship models, it's certainly been a thought-provoking conversation.
It has.
But we haven't even touched on Ryan's critique of how we view prehistory.
And that's another important piece of the puzzle. Ryan dedicates a significant portion of the book to challenging this popular view of prehistory as this brutal Hobbesian nightmare.
Right.
He argues that this nasty, brutish, and short narrative is a distortion, a projection of our own modern anxieties onto the past.
It's like so easy to fall into that trap of picturing our ancestors as like these club-wielding brutes,
Yeah, totally.
constantly fighting for survival.
Right.
But Ryan, he argues that that's just not an accurate representation of prehistory.
He presents this compelling evidence suggesting our ancestors actually live relatively comfortable lives. Like, archaeological research even indicates they had access to plenty of food, enjoyed leisure time, and formed these strong social bonds.
Really?
Yeah. It wasn't a utopia by any means, but it wasn't a constant, desperate fight for survival either.
Huh. It really makes you wonder if, like, we've been, I don't know, romanticizing the past or projecting our own modern anxieties onto it.
It's a possibility Ryan explores for sure. He even highlights how our bodies are still adapted to that ancient way of life. Like, we're not designed for chronic stress and the kind of anxiety many people experience today. We're wired for movement, social connection, and yeah, even pleasure.
That's a refreshing perspective.
Yeah.
It encourages us to consider that maybe, just maybe, our ancestors had a more balanced and fulfilling existence that we give them credit for.
Right. And this ties directly back to Ryan's argument about human sexuality.
That makes sense. If our ancestors lived in these close-knit, cooperative communities, sex would have played a much different role than it does in our modern, often isolated society.
Exactly. It wouldn't necessarily have been about possession, jealousy, or control the way it can be today.
Wow.
In those kinds of communities, sex was likely more about social bonding, pleasure, and celebrating life.
Interesting.
It's a dramatic shift in perspective, but it's supported by a growing body of anthropological research.
So we're left with this huge question. If we evolved in a world where sex was a shared communal experience, how did we end up with this modern emphasis on monogamy?
That's the question Ryan tackles in the final part of the book. He takes us on this fascinating journey through history, culture, and the evolution of societal norms. He explores the rise of agriculture, the development of the state, and how those events led to more complex systems of social control.
It's like he's suggesting that our social structures, they drastically reshaped our behaviors and beliefs about sex and relationships.
And that monogamy, as we practice it today, wasn't necessarily a natural progression, but a cultural imposition, a way to regulate human behavior and ensure the orderly transfer of property and inheritance.
Interesting.
It's a fascinating argument, and it's supported by historical evidence, too.
It definitely challenges those deeply ingrained assumptions that monogamy is the inevitable outcome of human evolution.
It's not about condemning monogamy, but rather understanding its historical context, its potential limitations, and its impact on how we view ourselves and our relationships. It encourages a more nuanced and informed conversation about love, sex, and everything in between.
And those conversations are so important.
They are. It's like Ryan saying, hey, maybe we've been sold a bill of goods. Maybe this whole monogamy thing isn't all it's cracked up to be. Or at least it's not the only path to a fulfilling relationship.
It's about being open to other possibilities, right?
Exactly. And that might involve some difficult conversations, some soul-searching, and a willingness to challenge our deeply held beliefs.
It's about questioning everything.
In a way, yes, but it's not about judging anyone's choices. It's about encouraging self-reflection and creating relationships that are based on mutual respect, honesty, and genuine connection, whether they're monogamous or not.
So how do we do that? Where do we go from here?
Ryan reminds us that we're not slaves to our biology. We have the capacity for conscious choice. We can choose to create relationships that align with our values and our deepest desires.
It's about open communication, being honest with ourselves and our partners about what we want and need. It's about challenging those rigid societal expectations and finding what truly works for us. It's a powerful message, and I have to say, this entire conversation has been incredibly thought-provoking. We've journeyed through the jungles of Indonesia, explored the fascinating social structures of bonobos, and questioned centuries-old assumptions about love and relationships.
It's been quite the deep dive.
It really has. And as we wrap up, I'm left with this one thought-provoking question, something for you to ponder as you continue to explore these ideas. What if our pursuit of happiness within the confines of conventional monogamy is actually at odds with our evolved nature? It's a bold question, but sometimes asking those bold questions can lead to the most profound self-discoveries.